I like to ask guitar instructors, what's the one lesson you wish you had learned when you were starting out? This video is my answer to that. I think gaining comfort moving around the fretboard and doing a little improvisation is a core skill that every guitar player can and should develop, and I think it can actually be a lot easier than it seems. So if you're a guitar player at any level, this lesson will get you jamming over a classic chord progression using a simplified version of chord tone soloing, and it will give you some significant insight into one of the most well-known guitar solos of all time. So in this lesson, I'm going to show you an easy and powerful way to play the minor pentatonic scale all over the fretboard without memorizing multiple scale shapes, a simple method for finding the money notes inside the pentatonic scale, insight into how Jimmy Page approached his classic Stairway to Heaven solo and why his approach works so well. And finally, I'll show you a method to create your own phrases and solos for the Stairway to Heaven solo section using a version of chord tone soloing that anybody can learn. I'm going to move a little bit quickly through a couple of topics and teach you only the parts you need for this lesson. There's more to learn behind these concepts if you truly want to master the fretboard, and I'll provide links to those full videos in the video description. Some of my videos assume music theory knowledge, but this lesson is completely self-contained, so you don't need any prerequisites to learn this. If you find this material useful, you can find detailed written lessons, backing tracks, and additional video content on my Patreon. And there's a downloadable written version of this lesson available for subscribers there or as a standalone purchase in my PDF store. There are 4 parts to this lesson. Step 1 is to understand the warp. The guitar makes it easy to move geometric patterns up and down the fretboard to change key. If I take this F chord shape and move it up 1 fret, it becomes an F sharp chord. We do this kind of horizontal translation all the time with bar chords and scale shapes. It's a little more complicated to move shapes vertically to a different set of strings, but if you understand the trick to it, it's not that hard. Let's start with an octave shape. If you start on a note on the low E or A string and you move up 2 strings and up 2 frets, you get to a note with the same name but 1 octave higher. And this octave shape works anywhere on the neck as long as you keep it on the lowest 4 strings. However, the masterminds who created standard tuning on the guitar threw us a bit of a curveball. Although most neighboring pairs of strings are tuned to be the equivalent of 5 frets apart, the G and B strings are tuned to the equivalent of a 4 fret span. We can work around that by imagining a dividing line between the G and B strings, which we'll call the warp. And incidentally, this is not my invention. I learned about it through John Finn's excellent advanced rock improvisation book, which is not for beginners, but it's fantastic for more advanced players. There's a link in the video description if you're interested. In any case, here's what you need to remember. If you have any geometric fretboard pattern that was created with uniform string tuning, like the 4 strings that fall below the warp, and if you move that pattern so parts of it fall on both sides of the warp, the part that falls on the upper 2 strings is shifted up 1 fret toward the bridge. So our octave shape becomes a 3 fret stretch if the upper note's on the B or E string. Step 2 is to use the stack shape to play the pentatonic scale. A scale is any collection of notes within an octave range. The most commonly used scale in rock and blues-based music is the pentatonic scale. Penta means 5, and there are 5 notes in the scale. We won't go into much more detail than that. One of the easiest and most powerful ways to visualize the pentatonic scale on the fretboard is with a shape I call the stack. There are 6 notes in the shape in groups of 2 on each string, always separated by 2 frets. Remember how I said that the pentatonic scale has 5 notes? Well, this shape has 1 of them repeated an octave higher. All of the notes in this shape fit exactly inside 1 octave. There are 3 ways that this shape can show up on the fretboard depending on where it falls relative to the warp. If it's completely below the warp, it just looks like a plain old stack. If the stack falls on the D, G, and B strings, the top part of it is on another side of the warp, so it's shifted over 1 fret. If it falls on the highest 3 strings, 2 of the pairs of notes are shifted over. So these are all the same pattern and the same notes, but they appear as 3 slightly different shapes on the fretboard. One really cool thing about the stack is that where one stack ends, another one begins because of the octave relationship between these 2 notes on the corners. So the stacks line up in simple diagonal patterns that let you play the pentatonic scale all across the fretboard. These 2 patterns are by far the most common way that guitarists move from one part of the neck to another. Now, to use these patterns in practice, you need to know where to put them on the fretboard. Step 3 is to know where to find the root all over the fretboard. So what do we mean by the root? The root of the scale is its most important note. It's what everything else is measured against. Since the pentatonic scale has 5 notes, there are 5 possible roots to choose from. But in most of the music we play, we only use 2 of them. If the root's on the upper left corner of the stack, we would call this the major pentatonic scale. And if it's the higher note on the middle string, we call it a minor pentatonic scale. For the rest of this lesson, we're only going to be using the minor pentatonic scale, so the root will always be there. In the song Stairway to Heaven, the root note is A because the chord progression's in the key of A minor. How you figure that out is another lesson, so we'll just take that as a given for now. Even if you don't have all the notes of the fretboard memorized, if you know these 4 places to play an A, the open A string, the 5th fret of the E string, the 12th fret of the A string, and the 17th fret of the E string, you can easily find all the other A notes just by using the octave shape we talked about before. So here's an example. If I start with my ring finger on the 5th fret of the low E string, I can play the top of one stack, continue up the diagonal and play another full stack, and then continue up to play a third one. It turns out the second stack I just played is the heart of the 5th fret A minor pentatonic scale you probably already know. And the third one is the upper extension that people sometimes call the House of the Blues. Now, don't forget that in addition to starting on the low strings and working up, we can also start on a higher string and work down. If you want to do that, these are the 4 A notes you would need. When we join stacks together diagonally like this, there's one bend that gets used more than any other. It's right here at the top string of the stack. If we bend it up to reach the note that's 2 frets higher, we're reaching an octave above the lower right-hand note in the shape. And this bend works all over the fretboard. Now I want to note that while using the stack shape like this is really powerful, it's not a complete method on its own for getting everything out of the pentatonic scale. I've got a whole separate video on this, so I won't go into depth here, but there's another simple shape I call the rectangle that's the key to visualizing the standard 5 pentatonic scale shapes all over the fretboard. I'll come back to that briefly in a minute. Let's talk about the solo section in Stairway to Heaven. The band is playing a repeating vamp with 3 chords in it, A minor, G major, and F major. They all come from the key of A minor, and so the A minor pentatonic scale we just learned is going to work really well here if we pay a little attention to note choice and phrasing. One key to making a solo sound good is to break your playing up into phrases. A phrase is like a short musical statement. It starts somewhere, moves around a bit, and then lands somewhere. A good place to start with this song is to create phrases that last for one pass through the vamp. And a great way to make it sound like you know what you're doing is to emphasize notes that match the chord that's playing. I'm going to show you the easiest possible way to do that. Each cycle of the vamp lasts for 8 beats. The A minor chord is played for 2, then G for 2, and then F for 4. So if we were to start a phrase by emphasizing a note from the A minor chord and end the phrase with a note from the F chord, it should sound pretty good. We can more or less ignore the G chord because it goes by pretty quickly, and as a listener, our brains tend to focus on beginnings and endings more than middles. And it turns out that this approach is pretty much exactly what Jimmy Page does for a lot of his solo. And this brings us to step 4, finding and targeting chord tones. Let's look at where we can find the notes of the A minor chord inside the pentatonic scale. We already know where the A note is because that's a note we use to place the stack on the fretboard. The other 2 notes are C and E, but we don't need to find them by name because they'll always be in the same positions in the stack, here in the upper left and lower right corners. And now let's look at where we can find the notes of the F chord. The F note itself isn't in the A minor scale, but you can always find it 1 fret above the bottom right corner of the stack or 2 frets below the middle row. If you're feeling ambitious and you really understand the warp that I was talking about earlier, there's another useful F note 1 string above the top left corner of the stack. With that in mind, let's take a look at a few of Jimmy Page's phrases from the Stairway to Heaven solo. The opening phrase starts with a bend from the top right note of the A minor pentatonic stack. If you visualize the stacks connecting diagonally, you can see that he's bending up to one of the notes from the A minor chord, an E. From there, he wanders around the familiar form 1 and then lands on the F note in the lower right corner of the stack to end the phrase. We can think of the second phrase as also being built around the stack, in this case the House of the Blues. But where normally we'd have our index finger on the lower notes and our ring finger to play the upper notes, here we start with our hands shifted down so that we can bend the lower notes. The first bend is up to the root of the A minor chord, The second note is actually a bend up to the 5th of the G chord, and then he slides up, wanders around the House of the Blues, and lands on an A, which is the 3rd of the F chord. If you keep going through the solo, you'll find that Jimmy Page continues to target chord tones throughout the whole thing, and it's worth learning and studying the solo through that lens. I have a video on Patreon that does this breakdown for every phrase of the solo, but I want to get you improvising, so let's build some phrases. You might need to take your time and plan some phrases out at first, but as you practice this, you'll find it easier and easier to use the stack shape and your knowledge of where the chord tones fall on it to improvise phrases on the fly. So let's build some phrases here in the House of the Blues. I like to start phrases by bending up to the 5th of the A minor, partly because that's the only note in the A minor chord that's not also in the F major chord. I can resolve the phrase to any of the 3 notes of the F chord, so here I'll do 1 to each of the notes, 1 to the 5th, 1 to the 3rd, and 1 to the root. I can do the same thing on the stack that's inside the form 1 pentatonic. Maybe here I'll start by targeting the A note in the stack and practice ending the phrase on each of the 3 F notes that are nearby. I highly recommend experimenting with using the other notes of the scale as targets too. You'll find that some of them work well to add a little tension, and others are really best used as passing tones. If you want to explore the full A minor scale, the only note we haven't touched yet is B, which you can find 1 fret below the top left corner. This approach to knowing where to find chord tones relative to the pentatonic pattern you're playing is a little bit like the Rosetta Stone of improvisation. It extends easily to all the chords in the key, and the same approach works with the rectangle shape in my rectangle and stack method. So this ends up being a really powerful visualization method. If you're intrigued by this approach to chord tone soloing, check out my Improv 101 course. It contains 8 step-by-step modules that will get you improvising fluently over chord changes in a matter of weeks or months rather than years. And there are no prerequisites other than being able to physically play single-note melodies on guitar. I'm currently rolling out the course to my gold level subscribers on Patreon, and you can find a link for that in the video description. I really do want to thank all my Patreon subscribers for making this channel possible. All paid members of my Patreon at any level have access to a backing track and other resources for this lesson, plus the detailed breakdown of Jimmy Page's solo. So check that out if you're interested. And if a subscription isn't your thing, and believe me, I totally get it, you can learn all the basics of my approach to playing scales, chords, and arpeggios across the fretboard for free here on YouTube. I recommend starting with the big picture video and going from there. It would help this channel a lot if you hit those like and subscribe buttons and leave a comment letting me know what solo you'd like to see me break down or what song you're having trouble improvising over. Thanks, and I'll see you next time.